The sound of the gallows being prepared sent shivers down Maggie Fullerton's spine as she stood in the jailhouse, her wrists raw from the shackles that bound her. Through the barred window, she could see the crowd gathering in Willow Creek's dusty main street, their faces twisted with a peculiar mix of righteous indignation and barely concealed excitement. It was 1878, and in this unforgiving corner of Colorado territory, a woman accused of murder might as well already be dead. "You've brought shame upon yourself in this town, Maggie," Sheriff Denton spat, his weathered face creased with contempt. "Doc Wilson was a good man, and you killed him in cold blood." Maggie lifted her chin, refusing to let the tears spill. "He wasn't what folks thought. I didn't kill him, but I won't weep for his passing." The sheriff scoffed. "Tell that to the judge. Trial's tomorrow, but we both know how it'll end." He jangled his keys. Folks are mighty eager to see justice done. As the sheriff left, Maggie pressed her forehead against the cool metal bars. 6 months ago, she'd arrived in Willow Creek with dreams of starting fresh as the town's new school teacher. Now, she was facing the hangman's noose for a crime she didn't commit. Outside, the townsfolk continued to gather. Their murmurs rose like a swarm of angry hornets, punctuated by occasional shouts demanding swift justice. The respectable women of Willow Creek clutched their shawls and whispered about the loose morals of the pretty schoolteacher who had rejected Doc Wilson's advances, the same Doc Wilson who'd been found dead in his office with his own scalpel embedded in his chest. The summer heat beat down on the plains as Garrett Morgan guided his horse along the rutted trail toward Willow Creek. After 3 years driving cattle from Texas to Kansas, he was tired of the nomadic life. At 32, he'd saved enough to buy a small spread of his own, and the letter in his saddlebag from his old friend Thomas Jenkins mentioned cheap land available near Willow Creek. The sound of an unusually large crowd caught his attention as he crested the hill overlooking the town. Frowning, he nudged his horse forward. Willow Creek wasn't much to look at a single dusty main street with the usual assortment of false-fronted buildings, but today it was alive with activity centered around the jailhouse. Dismounting outside the busy saloon, Garrett tied his horse to the hitching post and pushed through the swinging doors. The interior was dim after the harsh sunlight, but no less crowded. "What's all the commotion about?" he asked the barkeep as he ordered a whiskey. The man slid a glass across the scratched wooden surface. "School teachers being tried for murder tomorrow. Killed Doc Wilson about a week ago. Found him with his own blade in his chest." The barkeep leaned forward. "Pretty little thing, too. Shame she turned out to be nothing but trouble." Garrett raised an eyebrow. "Seems like you've already decided she's guilty." "Whole town has," the barkeep replied with a shrug. "Caught her standing over the body, hands covered in blood. Besides, she'd been causing trouble since she arrived, filling the young girls' heads with notions about women's rights and such. Doc Wilson was respected around here. Served as mayor for 2 terms before giving it up to focus on his practice." Garrett sipped his whiskey, listening as 2 men at a nearby table continued the conversation. "She refused his proposal, you know," said one, a portly man with spectacles. "Wilson was beside himself, said she led him on, then humiliated him in public." His companion nodded sagely. "No decent woman turns down a match like that. Doctor, landowner, respected citizen. She must have been up to something." Garrett had heard enough. He finished his drink and headed to the telegraph office to send word to Thomas that he'd arrived. The clerk directed him to Thomas's ranch on the outskirts of town, and by sundown, Garrett was seated at his friend's kitchen table, enjoying a home-cooked meal prepared by Thomas's wife, Clara. "So you've arrived just in time for the excitement," Thomas remarked, passing a plate of biscuits. "The whole town's been in an uproar since Doc Wilson's murder." "So I gathered," Garrett replied. "Seems the school teacher's already been found guilty in the court of public opinion." Clara looked up from her plate. "It's not right, the way they're treating Miss Fullerton. She's a good woman, educated back east. Came here to make a difference." Thomas gave his wife a warning look. "Clara's taken a shine to the school teacher, been to several of her reading circles for the ladies." "Because she's innocent," Clara insisted. "Doc Wilson was—" She hesitated. "He wasn't what people thought." "How so?" Garrett asked, his interest piqued. Clara glanced at her husband before continuing. "He had a way with the young women in town. Too familiar, if you understand my meaning, and when they resisted, He'd make sure they regretted it. "Clara," Thomas warned. "No, she deserves a fair hearing," Clara insisted. Maggie Fullerton arrived and started teaching the girls that they had value beyond being wives and mothers. Wilson didn't like that, especially when she turned down his advances. He spread rumors about her, said she was corrupting the youth. Garrett considered this information as he finished his meal. "Sounds like this trial might not be as straightforward as the town would like." "It won't be a trial," Clara said bitterly. "It'll be a public shaming, followed by an execution. Judge Parker's arriving on tomorrow's stage, and he's known for his swift justice." That night, as Garrett lay in Thomas's spare room, he found his thoughts returning to the schoolteacher locked in the town jail. He'd seen frontier justice at work before, sometimes fair, often not. Something about this situation didn't sit right with him. Dawn had barely broken when Garrett rode into town the next morning. A platform had been erected in front of the courthouse, and people were already claiming spots for the spectacle to come. He made his way to the jailhouse where 2 deputies stood guard. "I'd like to speak with the prisoner," he said. The younger deputy snorted. "Join the line, mister. Everyone wants a look at the murderous schoolmarm." "I'm her legal counsel," Garrett lied smoothly. The older deputy looked skeptical. "Ain't heard nothing about her having a lawyer." "Just arrived from Denver," Garrett replied, maintaining a confident demeanor. "Now, unless you want to explain to Judge Parker why you obstructed the legal process, I suggest you let me see my client." The deputies exchanged glances before reluctantly unlocking the door. 10 minutes, the older one growled. Maggie Fullerton sat on a narrow cot in the corner of the cell, her honey-blonde hair falling in waves around her shoulders. Despite the dirt smudging her simple blue dress and the dark circles under her eyes, Garrett was struck by her quiet dignity. She looked up as he entered, wariness etched across her features. "Who are you?" she asked. "Garrett Morgan," he replied, removing his hat. "I heard you might need some help." She studied him for a moment, her green eyes sharp and assessing. "Are you really a lawyer?" The corner of his mouth quirked upward. "No, madam. Just someone who believes everyone deserves a fair chance." Maggie stood, approaching the bars that separated them. "Why would you help a stranger?" "Let's just say I've seen enough rushed judgments to last a lifetime," he replied. "Tell me what happened." For a moment she seemed to debate whether to trust him. Then, with a deep breath, she began. "I found him. I didn't kill him, but I found him. I'd gone to confront him about the rumors he was spreading, rumors that I was improper with the students. When I got there, he was already dead." "Then why were your hands bloody?" "I pulled out the scalpel," she admitted. "It was foolish, I know that now. But it was instinct. I thought maybe he could still be saved." Garrett nodded. "Who do you think killed him?" "I don't know," she said, frustration evident in her voice. "He had enemies, more than people realize. She hesitated. "He wasn't gentle with women who refused him." "Clara Jenkins mentioned something similar," Garrett said. Maggie's expression softened slightly. "Clara's been kind, one of the few." "The trial's today?" She gave a bitter laugh. "Trial is a generous term for what will happen. Judge Parker's notorious for his hanging court. They'll parade me before the town, read the charges, and by sunset, I'll be dangling from the gallows they've been building all week." Garrett's jaw tightened. "Not if I can help it." "Why would you?" she asked again, genuine confusion in her eyes. Before he could answer, the door swung open and Sheriff Denton appeared. "Time's up." Garrett turned to leave, then paused. "I'll be at the trial, Miss Fullerton." Her smile was sad. "It's Maggie. And thank you, Mr. Morgan, though I fear your concern comes too late." By noon, the crowd had swelled to include nearly every resident of Willow Creek and many from the surrounding farms and ranches. The courthouse steps were packed as Judge Parker, a stern man with steel-gray hair and cold eyes, took his seat behind a table brought outside for the occasion. Maggie was led from the jail, her hands bound before her, escorted by Sheriff Denton and his deputies. As they passed through the crowd, people jeered and shouted insults. Someone threw a rotten tomato that splattered against her shoulder, staining her blue dress. "Murderer! Harlot! Hang the witch!" The calls came from all directions as the crowd worked itself into a frenzy. Garrett watched from the edge of the gathering, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip before he caught himself. Violence wouldn't help Maggie's cause. Judge Parker called for order, his voice cutting through the din. "We are gathered to determine the guilt or innocence of Margaret Fullerton in the murder of Dr. James Wilson. Sheriff, present the evidence." Sheriff Denton stepped forward, holding up a blood-stained scalpel in an evidence bag. "This is the murder weapon, found embedded in Dr. Wilson's chest. The accused was discovered at the scene, her hands covered in the victim's blood. Multiple witnesses saw her enter his office shortly before his body was discovered." "And what have you to say for yourself, Miss Fullerton?" Judge Parker asked, his tone suggesting he'd already made up his mind. Maggie stood tall despite the hostile crowd. "I am innocent of the murder of James Wilson. I found him already dead when I arrived to confront him about the lies he was spreading about me. I removed the scalpel in a misguided attempt to help, but he was beyond saving." Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the crowd. "Do you have any witnesses to support your claim?" the judge asked. "No, Your Honor. I was alone." Judge Parker nodded, as if this confirmed something. "Are there any who would speak in defense of the accused?" The crowd fell silent. Garrett saw Clara Jenkins start to move forward, only to be held back by her husband, fear evident on both their faces. Taking a deep breath, Garrett stepped forward. "I would." All eyes turned to him as he made his way to the front, standing beside Maggie. He could feel her surprise without looking at her. "And who might you be?" Judge Parker asked, irritation clear in his tone. "Garrett Morgan, Your Honor. I've just arrived in town, but I've spent the morning speaking with various citizens about Dr. Wilson, and I believe there's more to this story than has been presented." "Hearsay is not evidence, Mr. Morgan," the judge said dismissively. "Perhaps not," Garrett agreed, "but before you condemn this woman to death, shouldn't all possibilities be explored? For instance, has anyone checked Dr. Wilson's financial records? I've heard rumors that he was in debt to some unsavory characters in Denver." This was a complete fabrication, but Garrett needed to buy time. To his surprise, he saw a flicker of unease cross Sheriff Denton's face. Or, what about the fact that several young women in town had complained about his inappropriate behavior? Behavior that Miss Fullerton had publicly confronted him about, earning his enmity? Now the crowd began to murmur again, but differently. Garrett could see a few women exchanging knowing glances. Judge Parker banged his gavel. "This is highly irregular. Do you have any actual evidence to present, or merely speculation and gossip?" Garrett looked directly at the crowd. "I believe there are people here who know the truth about James Wilson, people who have remained silent out of fear or misplaced loyalty. But how can you stand by and watch an innocent woman hang for a crime she didn't commit?" A tense silence followed his words. Then, slowly, a young woman stepped forward from the crowd. She couldn't have been more than 20. Her hands trembling as she clasped them before her. "I have something to say," she said, her voice barely audible. Judge Parker frowned. "Speak up, girl." The young woman cleared her throat. "My name is Sarah Reynolds. 6 months ago, Dr. Wilson, Her voice faltered. An older woman rushed to her side, supporting her. "Go on, child. Tell them what he did." With renewed courage, Sarah continued. "He attacked me during an examination. When I threatened to tell, he said no one would believe me over him. He was right, I told my father, and he called me a liar." Tears streamed down her face. "Miss Fullerton was the only one who believed me. She was helping me write to my aunt in San Francisco so I could leave this place." The crowd's mood shifted perceptibly. Other women began to step forward, each with a similar story. Dr. Wilson, respected pillar of the community, had been preying on vulnerable women for years, using his position to silence them. Judge Parker, clearly uncomfortable with this turn of events, banged his gavel repeatedly. "This is not relevant to the murder charge." "Isn't it?" Garrett challenged. "It establishes that Dr. Wilson had enemies, women he had wronged who might have sought revenge. It also gives context to why Miss Fullerton would confront him, as she claims she went to do." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Your Honor, perhaps we should adjourn to consider this new information." But the crowd, which had been calling for Maggie's blood moments before, was now divided. Some still wanted a quick conviction, but others, especially the women, were demanding a proper investigation. From the back of the crowd, a man's voice suddenly rang out. "I saw someone else?" The crowd parted to reveal Martin Gibbs, the town drunk, swaying slightly as all eyes turned to him. "Mr. Gibbs, you're in no condition to testify," the judge said dismissively. "I was sober that night," Gibbs insisted. "Had to be doctor, was treating me for the shakes. I was waiting outside his office when I saw Mayor Harper go in the back way. There was shouting, then nothing. Harper came out looking like he'd seen a ghost, his hands all red. I didn't want no trouble. Then the schoolteacher arrived a while later." A shocked murmur ran through the crowd. Mayor Harper, who had been standing prominently among the town officials, turned pale. "This is absurd," Harper sputtered. "Gibbs is a known drunken liar." "Then you won't mind if the sheriff checks your alibi for that evening," Garrett suggested, "and perhaps searches your home for any blood-stained clothing?" The mayor's face contorted with rage. "How dare you? I was home with my wife all evening." "Actually, Charles, you weren't," came a quiet voice. Mrs. Harper stepped forward, her expression resolute. "You said you were going to the saloon. You didn't return until after midnight, and you burned your shirt the next day. I didn't think anything of it until now." Chaos erupted as Sheriff Denton moved toward the mayor, who suddenly bolted, shoving people aside as he fled through the crowd. He didn't get far before several townsmen tackled him to the ground. As the sheriff took the mayor into custody, Judge Parker, clearly flustered by the turn of events, called for order. In light of this new evidence, the charges against Margaret Fullerton are dismissed. Court adjourned. The crowd, which had been calling for Maggie's blood an hour earlier, now swarmed around her with apologies and congratulations. Some looked genuinely remorseful. Others simply wanted to be on the right side of the dramatic reversal. Through it all, Maggie stood stunned as Sheriff Denton reluctantly removed her shackles. Garrett managed to work his way to her side. "Are you all right?" She looked up at him, disbelief and gratitude mingling in her eyes. "You saved my life. Why would a stranger do that?" "Because it was the right thing to do," he said simply. "And because I know what it's like to be judged unfairly." Before she could respond, they were separated by well-wishers. Clara Jenkins embraced Maggie tearfully, while others who had been too afraid to speak up earlier now professed their support. Garrett slipped away, heading back to Thomas's ranch. There would be time to speak with her later, once the excitement had died down. The next morning, as Garrett was helping Thomas repair a fence line, he saw a rider approaching. It was Maggie, her hair braided and pinned neatly beneath a practical hat, wearing a simple riding skirt and jacket. "Miss Fullerton," Thomas greeted her. "Good to see you free." "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins," she replied with a smile. "I wonder if I might have a word with Mr. Morgan?" Thomas gave Garrett a knowing look before excusing himself. As he walked away, Garrett turned to Maggie. "How are you faring?" he asked. "Better than yesterday," she said, dismounting. "Though I'm not sure I can stay in Willow Creek. Some people are supportive now, but memories are short. In a few months, I'll still be the woman who was nearly hanged for murder." Garrett nodded, understanding. "Where will you go?" "I'm not sure yet. Perhaps San Francisco. There's more opportunity for a woman on her own there." She hesitated. "I came to thank you properly. You stood up for me when no one else would." "Anyone would have done the same," he said. She laughed softly. "We both know that's not true. The entire town was ready to watch me hang." Her expression grew serious. "Mayor Harper confessed this morning. He and Dr. Wilson were embezzling from the town treasury. When Wilson threatened to expose him to save himself, Harper stabbed him. I simply had the misfortune of arriving afterward. Justice has a way of finding its path, though sometimes it needs a little help," Garrett remarked. They walked in companionable silence along the fence line, the morning sun warming their shoulders. "What brings you to Willow Creek?" Maggie finally asked. "Looking to settle down. I've been drifting long enough." He gestured to the rolling land around them. "Thomas mentioned there's a parcel for sale just north of his property. Good water rights, decent grazing." "So you're staying," she said, something unreadable in her voice. "Planning to." He looked at her. "Unless there's a reason I shouldn't." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits who understood what it meant to stand apart from the crowd. "No," she said softly. "No reason at all." Over the following weeks, as summer gave way to early autumn, Willow Creek worked to come to terms with the shocking revelations about its former mayor and doctor. Judge Parker, embarrassed by his rush to judgment, ordered a full investigation that uncovered years of corruption and abuse of power. Several prominent citizens who had been complicit in covering up Dr. Wilson's crimes found themselves facing charges. Maggie resumed her teaching duties, though the school board, now with several new members, insisted on a public apology for their treatment of her. Attendance at her women's reading circle tripled, and she found herself becoming something of a reluctant symbol for standing up to injustice. Garrett purchased the land north of Thomas's ranch and began the hard work of establishing his own homestead. Each Sunday he would ride into town for church services, and afterward he and Maggie would often share a meal at the hotel restaurant. Their friendship grew naturally, built on mutual respect and shared values rather than the desperate passion that so often flared and died on the frontier. Maggie appreciated Garrett's quiet strength and unwavering moral compass, while he admired her courage and determination. It was on a crisp October afternoon, as they walked along the creek that gave the town its name, that Garrett finally spoke of what had been growing between them. "I've been thinking about what you said, about not being able to stay in Willow Creek," he began. Maggie nodded. "The talk has died down considerably, but I still catch whispers sometimes. And the parents of some children have withdrawn them from school rather than have them taught by me." "Their loss," Garrett said firmly. "But I was wondering if perhaps you might consider an alternative to leaving." She looked at him curiously. "What alternative?" He stopped walking, turning to face her directly. "Marry me." Maggie's eyes widened in surprise. "Garrett, Before you answer," he continued, "I want you to know that this isn't about rescuing you. You're more than capable of making your own way. This is about what I feel for you, what I hope you might feel for me as well." Maggie was silent for a long moment, the only sound the gentle gurgling of the creek and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. "When Dr. Wilson proposed," she finally said, "he spoke of how he would allow me to continue teaching until we had children. How generous he was to permit a wife such freedoms. He never once mentioned love or partnership." She met Garrett's gaze. "Is that what you're offering? A partnership?" "That and more," Garrett replied. "I'm offering my heart, my respect, and my promise that your dreams will be as important as mine. I don't want to own you, Maggie. I want to build a life with you." Tears glistened in her eyes. "The day you stood up for me, when the crowd was cheering for my shame, you said you would cheer for my freedom instead. No one had ever done that for me before." "And I meant it," he said softly. She took his hands in hers. "Yes, Garrett Morgan, I will marry you." Their wedding in November was a small affair, attended by Thomas and Clara Jenkins and a handful of others who had stood by Maggie during her ordeal. Sarah Reynolds, who had found the courage to speak out against Dr. Wilson, served as Maggie's maid of honor. Not everyone in town approved of the union. Some still whispered that there was no smoke without fire, that Maggie must have been involved in Wilson's death somehow. But as the months passed and Garrett and Maggie built their life together on their small ranch, even the most stubborn gossips found it difficult to maintain their suspicions in the face of the couple's evident happiness. Maggie continued teaching, riding to town each morning and returning in the evening to help with the ranch work. Garrett, for his part, supported her educational initiatives, even donating lumber to build a proper schoolhouse to replace the cramped room above the general store that had served the purpose before. By the spring of 1880, Willow Creek had changed significantly. The corruption that had festered under Mayor Harper and Dr. Wilson had been excised, and a new town council, which included Clara Jenkins as its first female member, was working to rebuild the community's reputation. Maggie's progressive ideas about education, once considered threatening, were now embraced as the town sought to attract new settlers. On a warm evening in May, as Garrett and Maggie sat on the porch of their modest but comfortable home, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, she laid her head on his shoulder. "Do you remember when you asked if I was all right after the charges were dismissed?" she asked. "Of course," he replied, his arm around her waist. "I was in shock then, unable to believe that a stranger would risk so much for someone he didn't know." She looked up at him. "I'm still amazed by it, even now." Garrett smiled. "It wasn't entirely selfless. I took one look at you standing there, facing down that crowd with your head high, and I knew you were something special." "So it was love at first sight?" she teased. "No, he said thoughtfully. It was respect at first sight. The love came after, as I got to know your mind and your heart. He kissed her forehead. And I fall more in love with you every day. Maggie's expression grew serious. I have something to tell you. She took his hand and placed it on her stomach. We're going to have a baby. Joy spread across Garrett's face. A baby? Are you certain? She nodded, her own happiness evident. Dr. Michaels confirmed it yesterday. He says I'm about 3 months along. Garrett gathered her in his arms, careful not to embrace her too tightly. You've made me the happiest man in Colorado territory. And you've given me what I never thought I'd find out here, a true partner and a home where I can be myself. She looked out at their land, the small herd of cattle grazing in the distance, the vegetable garden she'd planted beginning to sprout. When I came west, I thought I was just running away from my father's plans to marry me off to his business partner. I never imagined I'd find such freedom here. Freedom and love, Garrett added, kissing her softly. A powerful combination. As twilight deepened into night, they remained on the porch, planning their future and the changes their child would bring. They talked of expanding the ranch, of the school Maggie hoped to build that would welcome students regardless of gender or race, of the community they wanted to help create one, where justice and compassion took precedence over gossip and prejudice. Word of Maggie's pregnancy spread quickly through Willow Creek, and to her surprise, it seemed to wash away the last lingering doubts about her character. There was something about new life that made people willing to let go of old grievances. Women who had once crossed the street to avoid her now stopped to offer advice and hand me down baby clothes. The town's seamstress, Mrs. Abernathy, who had been among the loudest calling for Maggie's hanging, presented her with a beautifully crafted baby quilt as a peace offering. People are fickle, Maggie observed to Garrett after church one Sunday, as yet another well-wisher patted her growing belly. 2 years ago, they wanted me dead. Now they're fighting over who gets to host the baby shower. Folks got caught up in fear and rumor, Garrett replied. Most of them are good people who were led astray by those they trusted. They're trying to make amends in their own way. You're too forgiving, she said, though her tone was affectionate rather than accusatory. Maybe, he conceded, but holding on to bitterness doesn't help anyone, least of all ourselves. As summer progressed, Maggie's condition became more pronounced. She continued teaching until the end of the school year, but reluctantly agreed to take a break until after the baby was born. Instead, she channeled her energy into preparing for the child and working with Clara Jenkins to establish a proper lending library for the town. The baby, a girl they named Elizabeth Clara Morgan, arrived on a stormy night in early November. The labor was difficult, lasting nearly 20 hours, during which Garrett paced outside their bedroom as Dr. Michaels and the midwife attended to Maggie. When he was finally allowed to enter, the sight of his exhausted but radiant wife cradling their tiny daughter brought tears to his eyes. She's perfect, Maggie whispered as he sat beside her on the bed, his finger caught in Elizabeth's surprisingly strong grip. And she has your eyes. And your determination, Garrett replied, noting how the infant seemed to be studying them intently. She fought her way into this world just like her mother fights for what's right. The first year of Elizabeth's life brought both joy and challenges. The winter of 1880-1881 was particularly harsh, with blizzards that isolated the ranch for weeks at a time. Garrett worried constantly about keeping enough firewood chopped and ensuring their supplies wouldn't run out. Maggie battled bouts of cabin fever, missing her teaching and her friends in town. But there were moments of pure happiness too. Elizabeth's first smile, her first attempt at crawling, the way she laughed when Garrett bounced her on his knee. By spring, when the snow finally melted and the roads cleared, the Morgan family had grown closer through their shared isolation. As Elizabeth grew from infant to toddler, Maggie returned to teaching part-time, bringing her daughter with her. The school board, once so critical of her modern ideas, now praised her dedication and the innovative curriculum she developed. Several families from neighboring towns even relocated to Willow Creek, specifically so their children could attend her classes. Garrett's ranch prospered as well. His careful management and hard work paid off in healthy herds and good harvests from the small fields he cultivated. He hired 2 young men from town to help with the increasingly demanding workload, and there was talk of expanding further by purchasing adjacent land that had become available. In the summer of 1882, as Willow Creek prepared to celebrate Independence Day, Maggie received a letter that brought her past rushing back. Her father, a wealthy Boston merchant who had disowned her when she fled west rather than marry his elderly business partner, was dying. He requested that she return to make peace before the end. "I don't know what to do," she confessed to Garrett that night, after Elizabeth was asleep. "Part of me wants to ignore it, to let him die without the forgiveness he's seeking. He gave me none when I needed it." Garrett considered her words carefully. "What would you regret more, going and perhaps finding no real reconciliation, or not going and wondering if you might have found closure?" She sighed, resting her head on his chest as they lay in bed. "When did you become so wise?" "I married a school teacher," he replied with a smile. "Some of it was bound to rub off." After much deliberation, Maggie decided to make the journey east, taking Elizabeth with her while Garrett remained to manage the ranch. It would be their first separation since their marriage, and neither was eager for it. 2 months at most, she promised, as he helped them board the eastbound train in Denver. Just long enough to settle things with father and ensure mother will be provided for. Garrett kissed her deeply, then bent to embrace Elizabeth, who, at nearly 2 years old, was chattering constantly in a mixture of real words and her own invented language. "Take care of your mama," he told her solemnly. "Papa come?" Elizabeth asked, her lower lip quivering. "Papa has to take care of our home and the animals," he explained gently. "But I'll be waiting right here when you get back." The weeks of their absence stretched long for Garrett. He threw himself into ranch work, improving fences and expanding the barn, anything to keep his mind occupied. Letters arrived regularly from Boston, detailing Maggie's difficult reunion with her ailing father and her negotiations with the family lawyer to ensure her mother would be secure after her father's passing. "Father is not what I remembered," she wrote in one letter. "The powerful man who terrified me as a child is now frail and frightened of his own mortality. It's strange to pity someone you once feared so deeply. Elizabeth has charmed him completely, though. He calls her his second chance, and has changed his will to include her in his estate. I find myself torn between resentment that he can buy his way back into my life, and gratitude that Elizabeth will have opportunities I never dared dream of for her." When Maggie and Elizabeth finally returned in late August, they brought with them not only trunks of new clothes and books, but also news that would change their lives again. "Father has left Elizabeth a substantial trust," Maggie explained as they settled back into their home. "And he's left me controlling interest in his shipping company, along with a letter asking me to consider returning to Boston permanently to manage it." Garrett's heart sank. "And do you want to?" She looked around their modest home, then out the window at the ranch they'd built together. "This is where I found myself, where I found you. Boston may have opportunities and refinements that Willow Creek lacks, but it doesn't have the freedom I've come to cherish." Relief washed over him. "So we stay?" "We stay," she confirmed. "But we use some of Father's money to build the school. I've been dreaming of a proper academy where girls and boys both can receive an education that prepares them for more than just farming or marriage." True to her word, Maggie used her inheritance to establish the Willow Creek Academy the following year. The impressive 2-story building featured separate classrooms for different age groups, a science laboratory with actual equipment, and a library stocked with books on every subject imaginable. She hired additional teachers, including Sarah Reynolds, who had returned from San Francisco with a teaching certificate of her own. The academy quickly gained a reputation throughout Colorado Territory as a progressive institution. Families from as far as Denver sent their children to board with local families during the school year. Maggie's dream of providing quality education regardless of gender or background was becoming reality. Meanwhile, Garrett expanded their ranch operations, purchasing additional land and increasing their herd. The proceeds from Maggie's inheritance allowed them to implement modern farming techniques and build a larger, more comfortable home to accommodate their growing family. Elizabeth was joined by a brother, Thomas James Morgan, in the spring of 1884. As the years passed, the story of how Garrett had stood up for Maggie when the town wanted her hanged became something of a local legend. Parents told it to their children as a lesson about the importance of standing up for justice, Even when unpopular, the few remaining residents who had been most vocal in condemning Maggie eventually either made peace with her or moved away, unable to face the daily reminder of their mistake. By 1888, 10 years after the fateful day when Garrett had ridden into Willow Creek to find a mob calling for Maggie's blood, the town had transformed. The dusty, corrupt frontier settlement had become a thriving community known for its excellent school, progressive values, and prosperous farms and ranches. Garrett had served 2 terms as mayor, focusing on infrastructure improvements and fair taxation, while Maggie's academy had graduated its first class of students, several of whom had gone on to universities in the East. On the anniversary of their first meeting, Garrett and Maggie rode out to the creek where he had proposed. They dismounted, spreading a blanket on the ground for a private picnic. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been?" Maggie asked as they watched the water flow past. "If you hadn't arrived that day, if you hadn't spoken up—" "I try not to dwell on it," Garrett replied, pouring her a glass of wine. "But I do thank God every day that I was in the right place at the right time." Maggie raised her glass. "To timing, then. And to courage," he added, "yours more than mine." They clinked glasses, then sat in companionable silence, watching the play of sunlight on water. "The children want to throw us a party for our 10th wedding anniversary next month," Maggie said after a while. "Elizabeth has it all planned out, apparently. She's as bossy as her mother." Garrett laughed. "She comes by it honestly. And I assume young Thomas is eager to help. In his way. He's more interested in whether there will be cake." Maggie's expression grew thoughtful. "Sometimes I look at them and can hardly believe they're ours, these bright, confident children who take for granted the freedom to be themselves. That's what we fought for, isn't it? A world where they wouldn't face the same constraints we did?" She nodded, leaning against him. "And we've succeeded, I think. Elizabeth talks about becoming a doctor or a lawyer, as if it's the most natural thing in the world. No one has ever told her she can't because she's a girl. And no one ever will if her mother has anything to say about it," Garrett added with a smile. As the afternoon waned, they packed up their picnic and prepared to ride home. Maggie paused before mounting her horse, looking back at the creek. "I was so angry that day," she said softly, "standing there with the crowd jeering, knowing I was innocent but believing I would die anyway. I had lost all faith in humanity." She turned to Garrett, her eyes shining with emotion. "Then you stepped forward, a stranger willing to risk everything for justice, and you gave me back my faith in people, in possibility, in love." Garrett dismounted again, drawing her into his arms. "And you gave me a home, Maggie. Not just a place to live, but somewhere I truly belonged." They kissed as the setting sun bathed the landscape in golden light. 2 people who had found in each other not just love, but true partnership, a rare and precious thing in any time or place, but especially in the untamed West where they had built their life together. As they rode back toward their ranch, where their children waited and their future stretched before them, Maggie reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought her to this moment. The shame that had nearly destroyed her had instead been the catalyst for her greatest happiness. The crowd that had once called for her blood had become the community that now respected and admired her, and the cowboy who had stood alone against that crowd to cheer for her freedom had become the cornerstone of her life, her husband, her partner, her champion, her love.